Good greetings to you. Good greetings to you all. Nekanen no toka Tupac Enrique Costa yao Tashka Tatokan Nawakaris Kaloteka. Today we bring you a message. Today is the day, February the 11th, 2020, calendar of Pope Gregory. And today we bring you a message that is directed to the north, directed to the standoff at Wet'suwet'en. The message comes from our relatives of the Nahuas, the Totonaca's, the Ñañú, the indigenous peoples of Mexico, in the state of Puebla, from a community called Pahuatlán. The message was sent to us yesterday. We got it on the 10th of February 2020. And part of this message we're going to share with you. We transcribed it. We translated it and then we transcribed it into English for the purposes of it being shared with the relatives in the north. It's a message of solidarity from the indigenous peoples of Mexico, of Pahuatlán, the Nahuas, the Totonacas, the Ñañú, and the other indigenous nations who are also fighting the very same TransCanada corporation, now known as TC Energy. TC Energy at the present moment, in the year 2020, has 7 pipeline operations in Mexico. 7 pipelines either in operation or in the works. And of those 7, one of them is known as the Tuxpan-Tula pipeline. And this is the pipeline that our relatives in Pahuatlán stood up and fought back against that pipeline the same way as being done at the moment in Wet'suwet'en. The same corporation, the same pipe. In the case of Pahuatlán, it's a gas pipeline. And the pipeline was set to destroy some of the most sacred sites in the mountains of the Ñañú or Otomi, and desecrate the aquifers in the highlands of the Sierra, the mountain ranges of that part of Mexico that are sacred and are still preserved and maintained in their original reality, in the original state, in the original nature, as altars of the indigenous peoples in their territory. That goes back in that part of the continent now known as Mexico, that goes back beyond time immemorial. So today we have a message for you, for our relatives in the north, from our relatives in the south. This message comes to you from the Nahuacali, from Tonatiuh, the Nahuacali Embassy of Indigenous Peoples. We are located in the territory known as the Huehuetlapalan in our tradition, the Altam Jebet territories, the territories of the Altam nations throughout the territory in the central part of what is known also as the state of Arizona, but it encompasses in its entirety the watershed of the Colorado River, what is known as the Colorado River, where the Havasupai till this day are still guardians of that river and uphold the fight, not against the petroleum companies, but against the uranium mining, the same company, the same kind of assault. But today we send you this message because there's issues that are very urgent and pending that must be addressed as is being done in Wet'suwet'en, that it must be addressed as being done in Pahuatlán. But the issue that must be addressed is how we can take this fight forward collectively as indigenous peoples from Mexico to Canada against the very same corporate consortia and collusion and complicity of the 3 governments that are banded together at the present time in what is known in Canada as the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, what's known in the US as the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, what's known in Mexico as the Tratado Mexico-Estados Unidos y Canadá, the new version of NAFTA. For that reason, the urgency of this message today. So we're going to read the transcription of the translation of the message of Pahuatlán that's directed to our relatives of the Wet'suwet'en at the stand-up. But before we do that, we have a statement from the Continental Commission of Yayala, which has its secretariat here at the Nahuatl Embassy of Indigenous Peoples. The statement reads as follows. The Canadian government colludes with industry to commit the fraud of proposing a policy of criminal conspiracy intended to extract the surrender of Aboriginal title to Crown sovereignty in British Columbia in order to provide certainty, quote unquote, certainty in quotes, for the settler state corporate interests through legaloid mechanisms whose goal is the extinguishment of Aboriginal title. The date is February the 11th, 2020. Today, in light of the standoff at Wet'suwet'en, the fraud is fraught with fear, the fear of the truth. A settler state apparatus, the truth is, a settler state apparatus that presents its international personality before the world community as being a successor state to the nefarious doctrine of discovery of Christendom does not have the juridical competency nor standing in international law to legitimately abolish or force surrender of the land title of the original nations of Indigenous peoples. Up until 1960, and the proclamation of the universal human right of self-determination for all peoples in international law for the first time, according to United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1514, these policies of corporate state collusion were called for what they were: colonization, a crime against humanity, and a violation of international human rights law. Today, however, in 2020, colonization is called development. With the attention of the world now on the standoff at Wet'suwet'en and the conflict over the TC Energy TransCanada pipeline projects in Canada, the exposure of the fraud in British Columbia only adds to the risk and uncertainty for the international fossil fuel consortia across the board. This is due to added exposure to international denunciation and legal challenges that will cost the constituencies of the states and the shareholders of the corporations. The added exposure is due to one of the consequences, the added exposure is one of the consequences of the adoption on September the 7th, 2007, of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which establishes Indigenous peoples are recognized as equal to all other peoples in international law. The current case in point. With the announced change in the route of the TC Energy, that's TransCanada in Mexico, TC Energy Tuxpan-Tula pipeline in Pahuatlán, Puebla, Mexico, by President López Obrador in January 2020, barely last month, due to the resistance of the indigenous Nahua, the Totonaca, the Ñañú, the die is cast. The dominoes will fall. Risk rises, and uncertainty is now a red number in the liability column of the corporate accountants for the petrochemical conglomerates of the fossil fuel industry. This is global. The right of indigenous self-determination is an inherent human right, not a delegated privilege under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. Neither is it a line item in the UN Development Agenda 2030 to be swapped out in exchange for an elite international bureaucracy of feathered folk. The question, how can TC Energy, TransCanada, expect to get away with committing open fraud and complicity in corruption in Mexico, and then turn to the indigenous peoples in Canada and expect them to believe that the rights of indigenous peoples will be recognized and respected without discrimination? How can the Canadian Parliament right now, today, approve the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, the CUSMA, the USMCA, the TMEC? How can they approve the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement when these policies and practices of overt corporate colonization are being normalized under the terms of this international trade agreement in quotes? This is not a trade agreement, this is a colonization compact. The TC Energy TransCanada Corporation has colluded with the officials in the Mexican government to impose by force, duplicity, and corruption the blatant disregard for the territorial rights and human rights of the indigenous peoples. This amounts to 359 communities which would be affected by the Tuxpan-Tula pipeline. The Tuxpan-Tula pipeline connects 7 TC Energy TransCanada pipeline projects in Mexico with the Texas Tuxpan pipeline that is submerged under the Gulf of Mexico from Brownsville, Texas to Tuxpan, Veracruz. Clarifications are called for. Clarifications follow. The designation of indigenous peoples in the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement is definitive in terms of the recognition of indigenous peoples as peoples, explicitly as peoples. In the context of the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was not yet in place in 1994 during the original NAFTA agreement, the recognition of indigenous peoples in an international commercial agreement is necessarily accompanied and contextualized by the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples as articulated and affirmed in the principles and articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007. The principle of non-discrimination is a preemptive norm in international law. The principle of non-discrimination is a preemptive norm in international law. Therefore, the recognition of indigenous peoples as peoples in USMCA Article 32.5, Indigenous Peoples' Rights, must be taken as an affirmation and commitment to uphold, recognize, respect, and institute guarantees of protection for the collective human rights of indigenous peoples equal to all other peoples without illegal or arbitrary discrimination, including effective consequences in the form of legal remedies to address the violation of these rights, such as now occurring at the standoff at Wet'suwet'en. Colonization must not be disguised as development. Consultation is not consent. Indigenous peoples are rights holders, not merely stakeholders in the debate on development, in particular when it's occurring on their unceded territories. The original nations of indigenous peoples are not ethnic groups of the settler states of the Americas. To believe otherwise would be the equivalent of believing of 1,000 morons trying to drive a single ox cart. To believe otherwise would be the equivalent of 1,000 morons trying to drive a single ox cart. In the case of Canada, it would be a royal ox cart, that's for sure, but it would still be an ox cart. Now the message from our relatives in the South to the standoff at Wet'suwet'en. The Regional Council of Indigenous Peoples in defense of the territory, Puebla-Hidalgo in Mexico, on February the 10th, 2020, from Pahuatlán, Puebla, Mexico, make this message known. From nation to nation, message to Wet'suwet'en. This message is delivered from Ortencia Reyes Valdivia to the defenders of the Wet'suwet'en territory in the fight against the invasion of the TC Energy Corporation TransCanada in British Columbia, Canada. The message follows. relatives. From here, from these mountains in the Sierra, our message to you is that although we may live far from each other, I believe that we have to continue fighting for our Mother Earth and to defend our natural resources. For I believe that the original nations of indigenous peoples are of the earth. We are fully aware and convinced that our struggle is for life, for the life not only of our indigenous peoples, but of the millions of people who inhabit this planet, and therefore that we should not back down in our struggle. But on the contrary, I believe we must look for linkages of communication so we can continue strengthening each other in the common struggle. And from here in Pahuatlán, we shall also continue fighting to not let these mega projects advance in our traditional territories. Message from the indigenous Nahua, Totonaca, Ñañú, and other indigenous peoples in Mexico, from Pahuatlán to the defenders at the Wet'suwet'en standoff. Good greetings. Stay strong, stand your ground. Tupac, Huehuecoyo, Ayo.